Hi everyone, my name is Julia DeHart, and today I will be presenting Getting the Most from Feedback from the book Fieldwork and Supervision for Behavior Analysts, a handbook. So when most people hear the word feedback, they immediately think of criticism or someone pointing out what they did wrong. However, in behavior analysis, feedback has a much different purpose. It is one of the most important teaching tools we have because it helps improve performance, develop clinical skills, and ultimately benefit our clients. Throughout this presentation, I'll discuss why feedback is so important in the field of ABA, what effective feedback looks like, common barriers that can make accepting feedback difficult, and how we can use feedback to become better clinicians throughout our careers. By the end of this presentation, there are 4 main objectives I'd like everyone to take away. First, we'll discuss why feedback is such an important part of ABA supervision. Next, we'll look at the characteristics of effective feedback and what makes it more likely to improve performance. Third, we'll discuss behaviors that either help us accept feedback or interfere with learning from it. And lastly, we'll apply these concepts to professional practice and connect them to our responsibilities as future behavior analysts. Although this chapter focuses on supervision, these principles apply to almost every setting we'll encounter, including graduate school, fieldwork, and eventually supervising others. Before discussing how to give or receive feedback, it's important to understand why feedback matters in the first place. Feedback is simply information about our performance that helps us improve future behavior. Instead of focusing on mistakes, feedback provides guidance about what we're doing well and what we can do differently next time. In ABA, feedback benefits both supervisors and supervisees. Supervisors can ensure that procedures are implemented correctly, while supervisees continue developing their clinical skills. Research has constantly shown that feedback improves staff performance, increases treatment integrity, helps maintain newly learned skills, and ultimately leads to better outcomes for clients. As someone currently working as an RBT, I've experienced this firsthand. Sometimes my BCBA points out small things, like improving my prompting or collecting data more consistently. At first, those corrections can feel uncomfortable, but they make me a better clinician and help me provide higher quality services to my clients. And as someone in grad school, especially trying to become a BCBA, that is something I can definitely appreciate more now that I'm in grad school. And it really demonstrates the purpose of feedback. It isn't about criticizing the person, it's about improving their performance. One thing I really liked about this chapter is that it explains feedback using concepts we've already learned in behavior analysis. Instead of viewing feedback as criticism, behavior analysts view it as a consequence that influences future behavior. Think about the process shown on this slide. We begin with instruction, where the supervisor explains a skill. Then the supervisor models that skill so the supervisee can observe what correct performance looks like. Next comes practice, where the supervisee performs the skill themselves. Finally, feedback is provided. This cycle is important because feedback tells us whether our behavior should continue as it is or whether adjustments need to be made. We can also connect this to reinforcement. Positive feedback can reinforce effective performance and increase the likelihood that the behavior will happen again. Corrective feedback helps shape behavior by gradually moving the learner closer to the desired performance. This process is used constantly in ABA because it promotes skill development and eventually helps those skills generalize across different clients and settings. Behavior skills training, or BST, is one of the most evidence-based teaching methods used in behavior analysis. BST consists of 4 main components: instruction, modeling, rehearsal, and feedback. The first 3 components are important, but without feedback, the training process is incomplete. Imagine teaching an RBT how to run discrete trial teaching. You can explain the procedure and demonstrate it perfectly. The RBT can even practice it several times. However, if nobody tells them whether they're implementing the procedure correctly, mistakes can continue without anyone realizing it. This is why feedback is so essential. It helps correct errors immediately, strengthens correct performance, and prevents ineffective habits from developing over time. As someone working as an RBT, I know that some of my biggest improvements happened after receiving immediate feedback from my BCBA during supervision sessions. The chapter also discusses several evidence-based strategies that supervisors can use to make feedback more effective. First, expectations should be discussed before supervision even begins. This helps reduce anxiety because the supervisee knows that feedback is a normal part of learning. Supervisors should also ask how the supervisee prefers to receive feedback. Some people appreciate immediate corrections during a session, while others prefer discussing everything afterward. For me personally, I like when I'm corrected in the moment because I think it's more easier for me to kind of like see where I went wrong rather than if you wait till after the session. I'm probably not going to be able to like recall everything exactly. So I know personally I do appreciate feedback in that exact moment. Another important recommendation is collecting objective performance data. Feedback should be based on observable behavior rather than opinions or assumptions. The chapter also emphasizes behavior-specific praise. Instead of saying good job, a supervisor might say, you waited 5 seconds before prompting, which gave the client enough time to respond independently. I think that's something I've learned too, even just working with a client. I think just like talking from my one-to-one RBT role, just being more clear about what I'm reinforcing rather than just being like, good job, you did that, rather than instead like I'll say, you did a good job waiting, or that was a good job putting the puzzle piece down. Just being more clear and precise really allows them to help understand too, like what is being reinforced and that they know in the future and that it's being reinforced, so it'll increase. Finally, supervisors should model correct performance, explain why changes are important, provide opportunities to practice, and schedule follow-up observations. This ensures that feedback actually leads to improvement rather than becoming a one-time conversation. Effective feedback has several characteristics. First, it should be immediate whenever possible because people are more likely to remember exactly what happened. It should also be objective and based only on observable behavior. Feedback should always be behavior specific. Instead of saying someone did poorly, it's much more helpful to describe exactly what behavior should change. Respect is another key characteristic. Feedback should never attack the individual personally. Instead, it should focus on improving professional performance. Finally, effective feedback should be action-oriented. In other words, it should leave the supervisee knowing exactly what they should do differently next time. On the other hand, vague comments, delayed feedback, or personal criticism are much less effective because they don't clearly guide future behavior. And they end up just making the RBT or the behavior tech just kind of shut down in my personal experience of being in the field of ABA. While supervisors have responsibilities when giving feedback, supervisees also have responsibilities when receiving it. Receiving feedback professionally begins with active listening. Instead of preparing a defense while someone is talking, we should focus on understanding what they're saying. Asking clarifying questions is also important because it ensures we understand exactly what needs to improve, and if there are any misconceptions or you didn't receive anything, you can just clear it right then and there instead of holding it and you're just clarifying, which I think is really important. Another useful strategy is restating the feedback in our own words. This confirms our understanding and helps avoid misunderstandings. It's also important to acknowledge mistakes and practice a new skill rather than becoming discouraged. One sentence from this slide really stood out to me. Receiving feedback is an opportunity for growth rather than criticism. I think that's an excellent mindset because nobody begins their career knowing everything. I've been in the field of ABA for 4 years, and I'm constantly learning new things every day. You think you know something, and you find out you don't, and that's okay. You just keep on learning, and that's something that I feel like I've actually grown to appreciate more as I grow in this field. Feedback is one of the primary ways we continue learning throughout our professional lives. Unfortunately, receiving feedback isn't always the easiest. This chapter identifies several common barriers that interfere with learning. People sometimes make excuses, become defensive, argue, or repeatedly explain why they believe they were right. Others may withdraw completely or simply ignore the feedback they receive. Although these reactions can be understandable and can often just be human nature at times, they often reduce future learning opportunities. Supervisors may become less willing to provide coaching if they consistently encounter resistance. Instead, approaching feedback with curiosity and openness creates a much stronger professional relationship and leads to better long-term performance. Let's apply these concepts to this case scenario that I made. In this example, an RBT receives corrective feedback after a supervision session. Instead of listening, the RBT immediately becomes defensive and begins explaining why their approach was better. Although the RBT may have had good intentions, this response prevents learning from taking place. A more effective response would be to thank the supervisor for the feedback, ask questions if clarification is needed, and practice the recommended changes. This chapter also connects directly to the BACB Ethics Code. Accepting feedback helps behavior analysts maintain competence throughout their careers. The field of ABA is always changing. It is always changing. So staying connected to the BACB website and keeping up with their ethics code is really, really important, no matter what role you're in. If you're just an ABA therapist, RBT, or BCBA, it's always important that you're on top of that and just making sure that you're up to date with everything. It also supports effective supervision and encourages the use of evidence-based practices rather than relying on personal opinions. Continuing professional development is another ethical responsibility because behavior analysis is constantly evolving. Ultimately, accepting feedback protects client welfare. If practitioners ignore supervision or refuse feedback, client care may suffer. For that reason, being open to feedback isn't just a professional skill, but an ethical responsibility. To summarize, feedback serves many important purposes. It's a teaching tool, a learning opportunity, an essential part of supervision, and one of the primary ways professionals continue developing their skills. One of my favorite messages from this chapter is that the goal is never perfection. Instead, the goal is continual improvement. Every experienced BCBA was once a beginner who learned through supervision, practice, and feedback. And as I go through grad school and being a one-to-one and still learning, that is something that encourages me every day, is to know that every BCBA that I have right now guiding me was once in my position, and they are where they are now, and that will eventually be me, and I can help other future BCBAs along the way. And that's really encouraging, especially on days that are very hard for me. As I reflected on this chapter, I realized how much feedback has influenced my own professional growth as an RBT. At times, receiving corrective feedback hasn't always been comfortable, especially when I thought I was doing something correctly. However, looking back, those moments helped me become more confident and competent in working with my clients. They also reminded me that feedback isn't a sign of failure. Instead, it's evidence that someone is investing time in helping me improve. As I continue through graduate school and eventually become a BCBA, I hope to remember this perspective, not only when receiving feedback, but also when providing it to future supervisees. Creating a supportive environment where people feel comfortable learning from mistakes ultimately benefits both professionals and the clients that we serve on a day-to-day basis. These are the references I used for today's presentation. The primary source was Chapter 3 of Fieldwork and Supervision for Behavior Analysts, a handbook. I also included the BACB website because the chapter connects feedback to ethical responsibilities and professional competence. Thank you all for listening, and I hope that this was encouraging to watch for people going through grad school to be a BCBA. And yeah, thanks for watching.